Hello everyone. Let's get started. Today's lecture is going to be an introduction to anatomy and physiology. We'll be discussing a variety of things today, including some things that will be review. We'll introduce and define these terms, anatomy and physiology. We'll talk about the cell theory, characteristics that all living things share with each other, the universal characteristics that we find in all living cells. We'll talk about how multicellular organisms, like human beings, are organized and what those levels of organization are called. We'll spend some time talking about the language of anatomy, including the directional terms that we use to describe the structures of the body in relation to each other, and the planes that we can describe cutting through the body and the cavities that exist within the body. Finally, we'll finish up talking about the concepts of what is known as homeostasis and the concepts involved in different feedback mechanisms. But let's start with these terms, anatomy and physiology. What exactly are these sciences and how do they relate to each other? Anatomy is simply the science of the structure of an organism. We're going to be discussing the anatomy of human beings in this course. Physiology is very different. Physiology is the science that examines the interconnected functions of the body systems that exist within an organism. Now, one of the most important things to understand about anatomy and physiology is that they are tightly linked with each other. They are always linked with each other. We always teach them together because these two things, the anatomy of the organism and the physiology of the organism, are intimately connected with each other. Anatomy is about structure, or what you could think of as form of an organism, and physiology is about how it functions. You've probably heard the saying that form follows function. These two things are intimately connected with each other. For example, if you think about the heart, the job of the heart is to work as a mechanical pump and deliver blood throughout the blood vessels in the body. If the heart wasn't structured the way it is, it would not be able to achieve its function. Form and function are tightly connected with each other. Like all multicellular organisms, human beings are extremely complex. On this slide, over on the right-hand side, you're looking at an image of Leonardo da Vinci's famous Vitruvian Man. Da Vinci was fascinated with the anatomy of man, as were many other scientists and artists of his day. We've been studying anatomy and physiology for millennia now. And believe it or not, we still don't know everything there is to know about the human body. New discoveries are being made all the time. One of the most interesting features of the human body is how much normal variation there is within it. In fact, about 30% of people have some kind of variation in what we would consider normal anatomy. These are not diseased body parts. These are just variant body parts that often don't cause the person any problems at all. Human beings have been evolving over the last 200,000 plus years, and we continue to evolve. And our anatomy and our physiology change throughout that evolution. So let's start talking about how the human body is organized. Remember, at its most simplest, the cell is the subunit of life on planet Earth. It is the fundamental unit of all living things. Scientists throughout the 17th and 18th centuries worked to develop what we now call the cell theory, which tells us about the role of cells in living things. The cell theory has two parts. The first part says that all living things are made out of cells. And the second part says that all cells come from pre-existing cells. So it doesn't matter what kind of an organism you're talking about, whether it's a human being or some kind of a plant or a fungus or a bacterium. If it's living and it's on our planet, it is composed of one or more cells. Cells are the subunit of living things. We also know that cells don't just appear out of nowhere. Cells come from other cells. There are cells that are capable, in other words, of reproducing. Not all cells have this ability, but if they do, they are able to create two new cells from the old parent cell through the process of cell division. All cells are born that way. All cells come from previously existing cells. So cells are the fundamental unit of living things, and inside of cells we will find all of the components that are needed in order to keep that cell or that organism alive. If you look over on the right-hand side of this slide, we can see some common human cells. This image was taken under a light microscope, and it shows us some of the cells we find in a blood smear. The circular, smaller, magenta-colored structures on this slide are red blood cells. You can see that they have an indentation in the center that appears a little more lightly colored than the rest of the cell. The larger cells in the center of the slide are white blood cells. There are two of them, and they stain more darkly. These happen to be neutrophils, which are one of the several types of white blood cells that we find in animals. So all living things are made of one or more cells. And all living things also share other common characteristics. The list of what makes something alive is gonna vary depending on the source material that you look at. Depending on the type of scientist you speak with, they will give you slightly different lists, and they will tell you that one thing is more important than another thing when it comes to the characteristics of living things. But this list that you're looking at here, that has 6 things on it, these are the types of things that most scientists agree on in terms of the characteristics that living things have. For example, all living things have some degree of structural organization. In other words, they have pieces and parts, and those parts are organized to perform certain functions for the cell. All cells are capable of what we call metabolism. And remember, all metabolism is all of the different chemical reactions that go on within an organism to keep it alive. When we talk about metabolism, we typically break it down into 2 broad types of reactions, including anabolic. Those are the types of reactions that build or synthesize molecules. And catabolic. Those are the types of reactions that break down molecules. All living things are capable of metabolism in one form or another. Living things are all able to grow and develop. In other words, when you look at any cell or any organism, from the time that it is first created through cell division, throughout its lifetime, it's going to change, it's going to develop over time. All cells are capable of responding to stimuli. They are able to take in information from their environment and respond to it appropriately. All cells are capable of regulating what happens inside of the cell. Multicelled organisms like human beings have very elaborate regulatory systems in place to help control how, for example, the different organ systems interact with each other. And finally, last on the list, all living things are capable of reproducing themselves, one way or another. On this slide, we have another list. This list shows us the 4 things that all cells have in common with each other. So remember that there are organisms that are composed of one cell, and there are organisms that are composed of many, many cells, like human beings are. But when we get down to the cellular level, it doesn't matter what organism you're talking about. There are 4 things that all cells have in common with each other. The first thing is that all cells are wrapped by a membrane. Sometimes we call this the plasma membrane, sometimes we call it the cell membrane. Those terms mean the same thing. The membrane is what creates the cell boundary. Inside the cell, there is a gel-like material called cytoplasm. And it's the cytoplasm that contains all of the structures within different types of cells. All cells contain DNA and use that DNA as their genetic material. And finally, all cells contain structures called ribosomes. Ribosomes are essentially the machinery of the process called translation. Translation is the process that takes the information from the DNA molecule and uses it to build protein. So it doesn't matter, again, if you're talking about a bacterial cell, or you're talking about a fungal cell, or a plant or an animal cell. If it's any of those, if it's a living cell, it has these 4 structures in it at least. The other list we need to be familiar with is the list that describes for us how multicellular organisms, like human beings, are organized. Remember, we said that living things have structural organization. Multicellular organisms are very complex, and all of the different structures inside of them, from the smallest to the largest, have to be ordered and organized. So let's take a look at how these things are ordered, from the least complex structure to the most complex structure. And let's think about this on the level of a human being. If you take a human being down to its simplest structure, you would be at the level of an atom. So we're going to describe the least complex structure inside the human body as the atom. When you combine atoms, you build molecules. Those are a little bit more complex. From the molecule, we can develop what are called the macromolecules, and we'll be talking about macromolecules in the next lecture. There are 4 of them in the human body, including carbohydrate, protein, lipid, and nucleic acid. If we go up one level of complexity from the macromolecule, now we're at the level of the cell. Cells sometimes come together to work as a group. So a combination of cells that work together is what we refer to as a tissue. All of the cells inside of a tissue are held together by a substance called extracellular matrix. Sometimes tissues of different types come together and work to perform specific functions. We call that combination of tissue an organ. And of course, sometimes different organs come together and combine with each other to perform specific functions as well. We refer to those as organ systems. And then finally, the different organ systems will come together in order to create the entirety of the human being, or what we would call the organism. So from the least complex atom to the most complex organism, we have levels of organization inside the body. On this slide, we can see a diagram of these levels of organization. As you're studying this material, make sure you can walk it forward and backward. Make sure you can describe it both from least complex to most complex and the other way around. So remember, if we start with the least complex, we're talking about individual atoms. And atoms come together through chemical bonding to create molecules. Molecules are going to combine in order to create cells. And cells will combine to create various tissues. Different tissues can come together in order to work together towards a specific function. And we call that grouping of different tissues an organ. Organs come together and work to achieve functions of organ systems. And of course, if we take all of the different organ systems together, we will create the organism. These are the levels of organization that you find in all multicellular biological life forms.